Hello. You guys look cute. Thanks for being here. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you to Olivia. Thank you to me for being here. And guys, I have more research for this topic than any other thing I've ever droned on about for 2 hours in front of a bunch of people than ever before. So I'm going to jump right into it and try to not hold you hostage for too long. I won't be offended if you need to get up and, get more alcohol. I get it. Thanks. So let me start my stopwatch. I'm on a schedule. All right. So before I begin, I want to start this talk with a little bit of a dedication. This talk, in many ways, feels like a very full circle moment for me. Way back in the ancient days of 2013, when I was an undergraduate at School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I took a class called Chicago in Art and Architecture, taught by Professor Jim Yud. He's an art critic, a historian. It was the first education in Chicago history I ever received. It greatly inspired me and awoke me to the city around me. I name-dropped that class to get myself a job at Wendella Boats, which was my first Chicago tour guide job. And 12 years later, hello, I do this. I started this. You're all here. I talk to people about Chicago history all the time because of this class I took back in 2013. But I didn't just learn about architecture. We also dove deep into the severely overlooked history of our city's artists. Jim coherently, pointedly, and repeatedly illustrated our city's indifference to supporting their own artists, inevitably sending them fleeing to the coasts. And I watched this with my own friends who departed to New York and Los Angeles, the East and West Coasts, upon graduation. And it made me profoundly sad, and it really made me think critically about who our public art is made by and, how our city treats its artists politically, how we treat our artists by supporting them in everyday life. And that's something that Jim Yud taught me. He did pass away in 2018, but I still think about all the things he taught me all the time. And in many ways, I'm standing here before you because of him, or sitting here in front of you, I guess. So this one's for him. Now, the next thing I have to talk about is scope, okay? We have a lot of art in Chicago. At first, I bizarrely thought that I wouldn't have enough content for this talk. That's not the case. I have a timer. There are 500 publicly owned monuments, sculptures, plaques, and artworks located in the public way of Chicago, within city parks or exhibited in municipal facilities. Chicago public schools are home to over 400 early 20th century murals, the country's largest such collection, which doesn't include all their sculptures, mosaics, etc. There are more than 400 public murals registered with the city of Chicago, and that's just the ones that are registered with the city. And if we even want to scratch the surface of privately held artworks, the Art Institute of Chicago boasts a collection of 300,000 pieces or more, making it one of the largest art museums in the world. A very large percentage of our art is what we might define as public art. And when I say that, I just mean art that the public can engage with at no cost. Stuff you can just walk up onto the street and look at. It doesn't refer to how it's funded. It just refers to where it is and how accessible it is. Now, art of any nature, any of these hundreds of thousands of pieces I just talked about, can offend, annoy, disgust, bother, displease, or otherwise generate controversy. But I mostly focus in this talk on public art, and that's because I think there's something really special and amusing about work designed for the public that pisses the public off. And I'm always trying to find some humor and some inspiration in the past, so that's a lot of what I focused on. But I do also highlight 2 instances of art students pissing off public officials, which became very pertinent as of a WTTW article I read on my way here that I'll talk about at the end. It's just important to realize that the realm of human opinion is as vast as our art collections, and we could find one hater for every single piece of art in the city of Chicago. So I have just focused on the most famous, the most controversial, some of the most entertaining stories behind any of this. It is not a comprehensive talk. I'm not attempting to make it be, so that is my disclaimer. And I am on time. Okay. So I wanted to start by very quickly as possible, kind of going through the history of how we developed a culture of public art here in Chicago, a little bit of history of public art in Chicago. And I'm going to blast through the slides here. If you're watching the recording, don't worry, there's a link in the description. Now, obviously, indigenous people were creating art in this country for hundreds of thousands of years, but I had to limit the scope of this talk somewhat, so I decided to start in 1776, when modern America was arguably born, right? And when we first start making public art in the United States, you know, we are craving this, we're a young country, and we are craving the establishment and the culture and the refinement of European cities. We go with some super basic, crowd-pleasing content to kick us off. George Washington, at the time, everybody's favorite hero in America, more or less, and he's one of the first subject matters of the first public art that I could track down in the United States. 1784, marble, paid for by the government, and 1856, bronze in New York's Union Square, paid for by a group of shipping merchants. Now, throughout the presentations here, I have these very tacky orange price tags on all of the art to tell you who paid for the art, if known, how much it cost, if known, and our price here, regular price, our price, is what it would cost in today's money. Because one of the things I learned in my class at SCIC is to really think critically about who funds that artwork and how much it costs, and that actually is a generating point for a lot of controversy. So it's important. Now, post-Civil War, there's advancements in bronze casting, and there's this huge demand for sculptures of military heroes following the Civil War. Unfortunately, the South also follows this pattern. And there's also this rise of immigrant groups paying for monuments of their own national heroes, which will come back to bite us in the end. Now, some of the earliest works in Chicago's history, the earliest I could track down, are actually in Rose Hill Cemetery by Chicago artist Leonard W. Volk. So if they're a Chicagoan in this presentation, I gave them a Chicago star. How Chicagoan someone is a hard thing to quantify. It's something we think about a lot at Chicago for Chicagoans. So there's a couple of people I gave half stars to. I gave them partial credit. This is not a precise system by any means. Leonard W. Volk created two works in Rose Hill Cemetery, again, low-hanging fruit, commemorating volunteer firefighters, 1864, and our heroes, 1869, Cook County's monument to the Union forces. The next ones that we get into here are Drexel Fountain, donated to the Park District, 1881, oldest existing public sculpture in any Chicago park. It has Mr. Drexel up top. His sons paid for it. Eli Bates, meanwhile, funded a bunch of monuments in Lincoln Park upon his death in 1881, several by Augustus St. Gaudens, very famously Standing Lincoln here, and Storks at Play, both in Lincoln Park. And that brings us to our first controversial artwork. 1889, this is the Haymarket Riot Memorial. It was paid for by the Union League of Chicago and sculpted by half-credit Chicagoan Johannes Keller. He lived here for a while, but not forever. Now, the problem with this monument is that it memorializes the 7 police officers that died at the Haymarket bombing in 1886, but not the 4 civilians who died or the 8 anarchists that were later sentenced to death. So long story short, with the Haymarket riot, people were protesting for the 8-hour workday. They got into a tussle with the police. Someone threw a bomb, no one knows who, and then 8 working class people were arrested and later hung. Okay, so this monument eliminates all of that, and it's like the sacrifice of police. It was not even popular upon installation and is a really great example of how history is written by those with the money and time to write it. It has been bombed twice, struck by a streetcar, vandalized on countless occasions, some say more than any other piece in the city, and has been moved 7 times. It is currently outside of the police district headquarters, which is probably the best place for it. Now, leading up to the World's Fair of 1893, lots of competitions for public art, and the exhibition itself is a place for a ton of public art. Some of the most famous from the city, from the fair, Columbia Fountain, as well as Statue of the Republic, which we later made gold and installed in a replica of in 1906. And Lions in front of the Art Institute, also made in 1893, based kind of on the content, some of the statues in the fair, not necessarily made for the fair. Anyway, there's some debate. 1893, that's the important part. Okay. Now, afterwards, people are like, wow, public sculpture is really freaking cool. Let's commission some. George Pullman, everybody's favorite asshole, paid for a very tasteless sculpture of the Fort Dearborn Massacre, we don't call it that anymore, installed near his Prairie Avenue home. It is now, fortunately, in storage and was created by a partial Chicagoan. Statues of great men began to appear around the city. Men, that is. Shakespeare, 1893, Leif Erikson, 1901. The interesting thing about the Leif Erikson one is that it was a good example of immigrant groups paying to, memorialize people from their own culture. It was paid for by a bunch of Norwegians. Shakespeare, I guess, he's cool. You get Fountain, Laredo Taft, hardcore Chicagoan, Fountain of the Great Lakes in 1907, another really famous one. There's also many murals at the 1893 World's Fair. Very famously, Mary Cassatt did some paintings, some murals in the women's building at the fair, and those inspired quite a bit of public murals. You ended up with William Penhallow Henderson, a Chicagoan, at least partially. He creates a variety of murals at Joliet Township High School. I can't find images of these. That was in 1906. The South Park District regrettably hires this guy, John Warner Norton, to do some very poorly aged like milk paintings in several South Park District field houses. Sherman Park gets the treachery of the Indians, rough. 1912, and Hamilton Park has some colonial figures from 1916. Which brings us into the 1920s and 30s, where we went real hard on the public art. Buckingham Fountain, world's largest fountain at the time it was installed, 1927, donated to the city by the philanthropist Kate Buckingham. The architect, a Chicagoan. The sculptor, French. I gave the fountain partial credit. And, of course, Ceres on top of the Board of Trade. John Storr, I'm also calling a partial Chicagoan. Fight me. Okay. Then comes something monumental in public art history, which is the New Deal. That thing Franklin Roosevelt created to help Americans rebuild from the Great Depression. He, as a program of the New Deal, there is something called the Federal Art Project. It's created in 1935 and lasts all the way until 1943, basically by the time World War II made all those superfluous Depression jobs unnecessary. It created nearly 10,000 jobs for artists and produced over 225,000 murals, sculptures, and mosaics, all intended for public buildings. The cool thing about this program, I knew about this. I know of WPA murals, as they're often called. I had no idea the terms of this program. Needy artists received weekly salaries and had to submit a piece of work every 4 to 6 weeks. There was no specific subject requirement, but there was a strong preference for realism and things that were kind of, again, low-hanging fruit, things everybody could kind of agree on. American progress and values. Program alumni might surprise you. Some of the people who were paid salaries by this program include Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock, both noted abstract artists. I think a lot of them approached it as sort of like one for them, one for me. I mean, you only got to turn in a piece every 4 to 6 weeks, right? Like, I've made art faster than that in art school many times. Now, the program was still discriminatory by modern standards, but it did include women and black artists, which was a big deal for them especially, and responsible for the installation of hundreds of thousands of WPA murals in Chicago area, schools, hospitals, post offices, and other public buildings. Not all of the work was painted by Chicago artists, but that just gives you a very vague sense of the scope of the WPA murals in Chicago. I have pictures of Epics in the History of Man up here, 2 panels from it by Edgar Britton, Chicagoan. These are in the Lane Tech High School lunchroom. Another good example that's very easy to find from the last year of the program, 1943, 2 painted tile murals from the Uptown Post Office. Go see these. They commemorate Chicago heroes, Carl Sandburg and Louis Sullivan, although the artist himself was not a Chicagoan. Then art takes a turn. Jackson Pollock's a splattered paint, and the little blocks of color next to him is Mark Rothko. These guys did WPA murals. Like, these guys were doing this, too. So art begins to really change after World War II, and it's important to kind of keep this in context. You have abstract expressionism, which is very abstract and expressionist. You have pop art, which is bold, incorporates images from popular media. Neo-Dada, which is just irony, found objects, kind of nonsense. You get this wave of minimalist sculpture using anthropomorphic forms and steel and industrial materials. And here in Chicago, you get the Chicago images, baby. A group in Chicago, very loose group of Chicago artists, 1950s to 1970s. A lot of them were professors at SAIC. You get some really weird, unique art coming out of Chicago in this period. No one talks about it. The Art Institute only put up a show for it like a few years ago. You get these incredible artists that were making stuff that was grotesque, irreverent, comic-like. They did a lot of jokes, a lot of inside jokes. There were more women that were Chicago imagists than like any other art movement of the time. Some of the work that's up here is by Ed Paschke, a name you might recognize, Roger Brown, Jim Nutt, Gladys Nielsen, Sue Ellen Roca, there's Barbara Rossi. There's so many great Chicago imagists, and if you're not familiar with them, go on theinternet.com and do some research. These are your people. This is your legacy, and we don't care about them. I'm going to get into that. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, we're doing this really destructive thing called urban renewal, and so there's a lot of opportunities for these brand new public plazas downtown. We're building a lot of skyscrapers in the 1960s and 70s, and this sort of debuts what some call the golden age of Chicago's public art, and part of this is because of new federal programs. You know, the federal art project ended with World War II, and so then you get these sort of new things coming to take its place and support our society's artists. The Art and Architecture program from the federal government dates to 1962. It was expanded in 1972 by Nixon. In it allots 1/2 of 1%. 1/2 of 1% of all costs for new federal buildings be allotted for the commission of artwork. In 1977, the state of Illinois establishes their own program, still 1/2 of 1%, for all new and renovated state buildings. And in 1978, the city of Chicago bizarrely allocates 1.33% of construction costs for municipal buildings and public spaces for the procurement of artwork. Chicago does do something I respect. They stipulate that at least half of the commissions be awarded to Chicago artists. We love to see it. Unfortunately, most of what you're looking at above here was not a Chicago artist. I have a lot of mean things to say about that, but I'm going to skip that. We're coming back to these guys. Except for the Chagall mosaic. I fucking hate it. Fight me later. I can't get into it. I had to trim something. Okay. Also around this time, outside of the art establishment, as one nasty Chicago Tribune critic called it, outside of the establishment, you had this explosion of public community murals around this time as well. The Wall of Respect in Bronzeville only lasted a few years. It was painted in 1967. The building was torn down in 1971. It depicted African-American heroes and is considered the country's first large-scale outdoor community mural, painted by 14 different artists from this community group here on the slide that the name is very long for me to read. Next, as well, I have to name drop this one. We talk about it on our Pilsen tour. There is a culture in our community, 1971, painted by Ray Padalon and 40 neighborhood youth corps members down in Pilsen on the former Casa Atzlan Community Center. In 2017, a gentrifying luxury property management company painted over it. Come on our Pilsen tour to learn about that. Part 2. I like to call this, how am I doing on time? Oh no, okay, I think we're doing good. Okay, good, all right. It's okay. So this is a section of my presentation I've titled, "What the fuck is that and how dare you?" Now, there are some big artworks at this time, and there are some big opinions at this time to go with them. The first large-scale public sculptures paid for by these Percent for Art programs at the federal, state, and municipal level were received overwhelmingly poorly. People did not like them. A chief criticism was the cost, the enormous cost, because there was this very small aspect of public funding. People were like, that's my tax dollars. Why did you buy that ugly fucking thing with it? Pardon my French. Now, a couple things. I have a bit of a beef with this. First of all, making a giant plaza-sized sculpture is never going to be cheap, especially not when you're seeking to hire the most famous old white European artists money can buy. Also worth noting, Buckingham Fountain cost $750,000 when it was built in 1927, granted, private funds, but that is the equivalent of over $2 million in 1970s money, which is 6 times the price of the most expensive, contentious artwork I'm about to talk about. So people were a bit dramatic, okay? Come on. The other sticking point was subject matter. Abstract art, always contentious. It requires an open mind to understand and learn to love, and people didn't want to do that. Especially columnists at the Chicago Tribune. I'm going to read a lot from them. They were some haters. Okay. We're going to talk about this one. You guys know this piece? It actually doesn't have a title. This is Untitled by Picasso in Chicago. It's mostly called the Chicago Picasso or the Picasso, depending on where you are at that point in time. In 1960, the Public Building Commission of Chicago, so this is a municipal project, they decide to build the Daly Center, and along with it, they're like, we're going to put this monumental sculpture in the plaza. Names were tossed around. As architect Carter Manny remembers, it was suggested that we put names in a hat, and remarkably enough, everyone had chosen Pablo Picasso. Not one of their artists. It was thought Mayor Daley would oppose it due to his conservative opinions, but he reportedly said, if you gentlemen think he's the greatest, that's what we want for Chicago, and you go ahead. Daley wanted the best for his city. Picasso was 82 years old at the time, living on the French Riviera, and, quote, not one to make appointments. But architect William Hartman, part of the committee, was determined as fuck. He made multiple visits to Picasso at his home, gifted him scrapbooks, White Sox jersey, a Native American headdress, and even wrote him a poem. After 2 years, Picasso accepted the gig. All he did was make a little tiny sculpture known as a maquette. He refused a check for the artwork. They offered him $100,000, and he reportedly said, this is my gift to the people of Chicago, and later noted, I never accept commissions to do any sort of work, but in this case, I'm involved in civic projects for the 2 great gangster cities, referring to Chicago and Marseille, France. It costs, so if the artist donates their time, that doesn't mean that the sculpture is free, that the Picasso is free. This cost $352,000 to fabricate and install, mostly covered by charitable family foundations in the area. Mayor Daley reportedly approved, telling aides it looks like the wings of justice. It was unveiled August 15th, 1967. Richard J. Daley introduced it with the line, we dedicate this celebrated work with the belief that what is strange to us today will be familiar tomorrow. Earl Bush, his press secretary, recalls the lowering of the shroud at the unveiling. Lo and behold, everybody gasped, what is it? WTTW later said, if you ask 5 different passerby at random what the sculpture outside of the Daly Center represents, you're likely to get 5 different answers. It's said to have been inspired by Picasso's Afghan hound, a baboon, and 2 different women. It has been compared to a bird, a gorilla, a monster, a horse, a cow, a bride, and junk. Chicago Tribune journalist Bill Granger, a notable hater, called it a piece of iron and a joke, and said that tourists are barely able to control their laughter. There is not, in fact, a rustic corner of the Republic where people do not gather to guffaw about the Chicago dog. Alderman John Hoellen of the 47th Ward wasn't much kinder. He said that the Picasso reminded him of a, quote, heroic monument to some dead dodo, and suggested that it be deported to France and a statue of Ernie Banks be erected in its place. This is not the first time someone will suggest our artwork should be limited to statues of Ernie Banks. Many people came to its defense over the years. People praised the way that the Cubist sculpture changes as you walk around it. WTTW producer Phil Lanier said, "The Picasso is like a good friend. It reveals itself to you little by little as you come to know it." Oh dear, I'm 3 minutes behind. Okay. Next up, Flamingo. This one was quite controversial. This was the first work commissioned by the General Services Administration, who managed the federal Percent for Art program. This is the first piece the federal government ever purchased with that 0.5% of construction costs for Federal Plaza around it. Alexander Calder, the artist, was reportedly chosen because of his well-established international reputation, the feeling his works were sufficiently modern, yet not so radical. And because the shape of his statue would complement the very rigid geometry of the Mies van der Rohe buildings around it. Like his peers, Calder was older, 75, when he was commissioned. He, too, only made a little statue, a maquette, and shipped it off to Connecticut for fabrication. He never really talked about the meaning. He said, he wanted, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, he wanted people to interpret it the way that they wanted to. This color became known as Calder Red and was chosen to offset the building from the black buildings around it. The design made its debut in 1973. The statue was installed in 1974. The biggest talking point from the beginning was the cost. $325,000, which is about $2 million today. It was the most expensive artwork ever provided by the federal government for a public building. It was also the first. The WPA murals were, yes, provided by the federal government, but they were paying weekly salaries for them. It's not a fair thing to say, in my opinion. Anywho, not helping the matter, the Sun-Times reported at the time that the distinctive red imported paint cost $48 a gallon. Chicago Tribune architecture critic Paul Gapp despised it. Paul Gapp despised everything. He said, "The kindest thing that can be said about Flamingo is that it is vandal-proof and appears to frighten away pigeons. But $325,000, good grief!" Printed in the Tribune. Gapp went on, he said, "Visiting the Federal Plaza was about as exciting as undergoing root canal therapy. A dull expanse of granite pavement, a few slab seats for the proletariat, a tiny bit of greenery, and of course the grotesque and brutalistic Calder sculpture. It all looks so riot-proof." He went on to call it a junkyard sculpture, said it complemented the banality of the buildings it was supposed to enhance. He felt the work was elitist. Paul Gapp hated the art establishment, whatever the hell that means, and was like, "It's my right to criticize it. It's my tax dollars." He loved the Marc Chagall mosaic, which is why Paul Gapp and I don't have much in common. I'll read some quotes from letters to the editor. James C. Leighton, a regular Chicagoan, said that this he called for a national condemnation of the uglies and complained that they take up space which could be better used for something pleasurable or meaningful to our ailing economy. Art makes you feel good. What's so wrong with that? Okay. Tribune journalist Bill Granger, that hater, again, he's called it an orange spider, and this actually really amuses me. He mused that Calder must have been working in his backyard one day when his wife said, "Calder, that is the ugliest piece of junk I've ever seen. I want it out of my backyard by sundown." Published in the Tribune. More lightheartedly, another local simply noted, "The first time I saw it, I thought a new McDonald's was under construction." Absolutely. Tragic. Okay. This brings us to another one people really didn't like, but Klaus Oldenburg, I'm giving him full Chicago credit. Yeah, Klaus. So this was the next Percent for Art program, another federal project. This is because we're talking about municipal, federal, and state projects. This is a federal project awarded 1975. It was placed outside of the new Social Security Administration building. It was awarded to Klaus Oldenburg, and then he submitted a design. He was raised in Chicago as a child. He studied here. He worked as an adult. He opened a studio. He moved to New York in 1956, and I forgave him because he wrote us a poem upon his departure. Look it up. Klaus Oldenburg was known for being a pop artist. He was fascinated with scale. He did all of these larger-than-life sculptures of everyday objects. He just didn't think art should be so serious, and I kind of agree. Oldenburg, 46, was the unanimous choice of the selection committee. I haven't any idea what to put up, he said to Tribune art critic Alan Artner after the announcement. The spokeswoman for the federal government said, "We expect it will be complementary to the building and the site. We would not practice censorship, although we would oppose genitalia." Oldenburg toyed with a lot of different ideas. He had actually even conceived several public artworks for Chicago in his time here, including a large spinning bat to be placed outside of his alma mater, the Latin school, that wasn't chosen. And Klaus, I think it's important to note, had certainly developed feelings about bats after attending the 1968 Democratic Convention and being savagely beaten by cops with nightsticks. But he liked many ideas, many aspects of the bat idea. He felt the symbol was appropriate to our interests. We have 2 Major League Baseball teams. He liked that the verticality referenced the city's tall skyline, and he created this lattice structure, opening it to kind of reference the lattice steel bridges of the city. He proposed painting it red, and they told him no because Alexander Calder had already done that. It was unveiled in April of 1977. Acting Mayor Michael Bilandic happily welcomed the artist, a victim of his predecessor. He remarked, "The bat column could be called a monument to baseball and, undoubtedly, to the ambition and vigor that Chicago likes to see in itself." The unveiling was attended by the United States Navy Band, Chicago Cubs players Ernie Banks and Billy Williams. The second lady, noted art champion Joan Mondale, released white balloons printed with thread designs to resemble baseballs. I read that and I was like, really? In the 70s, guys, you were just releasing plastic balloons into the air and I can't have a straw? Like, if you were alive in the 1970s, like, ugh! Okay. Sorry. So, unfortunately, there was a protest right across from the unveiling. I have a snapshot of it from the Tribune on the slide right here. A group of artists protest the sculpture. They called themselves the Surrealist Movement of the United States. They called Oldenburg a miserable lapdog, wanted the expensive joke torn down, said it was a serviceable symbol of repressive authority, and, the GSA lady would have hated this, obviously phallic. The Chicago police ended up removing 3 people from this protest for using obscene language, which again, like Klaus Oldenburg was beaten by the Chicago police. The irony does not escape me. Spectators at the event were lukewarm on it at best. "Whoever put that up must have been hit by it," said the hotel desk clerk across the street. "I don't know what a bat has to do with the federal government," remarked another, who thought it should have been placed in front of one of the baseball stadiums. "At least we know what it is," quipped another. Oldenburg unfortunately got dinged for the color, which wasn't even his fault. One area resident said, "I think that gray color is bad with the gray buildings behind it, but the pigeons will take care of it." Again, this is the second criticism we've heard about pigeons and their relationship with public art. Chicagoans are obsessed with what pigeons are going to do to our public art. The funding also, as you might guess, generated controversy. One bystander felt the cost was ridiculous for what it was and wondered why they didn't buy a statue of some old people or something like that. Wisconsin Senator William Proxmire took it a step further. He gave the project one of his, I assume, coveted Golden Fleece Awards presented to government programs that fleece the voting public. "Baseball is indeed our national game," he said. A statue of Babe Ruth, Ernie Banks, or Bill Madlock would have had some merit. But a $100,000 bat paid for by all of America's taxpayers is a strikeout with the bases loaded. Oldenburg responded to this one. He said, I don't want to be critical, but somebody wrote that Proxmire's hair transplants have gone too far down into his brain. Ernie Banks also went on the record and said he did not like the idea of a sculpture of himself. What do you guys think Paul Gapp, architecture critic of the Chicago Tribune, felt about this one? You're correct, he hated it. He complained about the price and the art establishment's taste, calling Oldenburg a put-on man and poseur. Now, Jim Furr, professor at the Art Institute, couldn't let the critique slide this time. In a letter to the editor, he did the math. He noted the piece cost only 1/100th of a cent per person when divided across all U.S. taxpayers at the time. I love that he did the math. He pointed out that Impressionists and many other later beloved artists faced violent public outcry at their debut and asserted that initial public animosity encourages thought and thereby growth. He also responded to the elitism allegations. He was like, selecting art by a public committee would be hopelessly complex. And, he pointed out that public art by its nature is out of the rarefied atmosphere of the museum. Anyone can go up and look at it. So how is this elitist work? And I think that's a really, really good point. Oh, dear. Okay. Sorry, I'm running over on time. Mayor Bilandic will close us out. Quoted from his speech at the unveiling, just like the Picasso when it was unveiled, the Bat column is already starting a public debate. And just like Picasso, this one will triumph. It has a respectable 3 stars on TripAdvisor. Cracks me up. The Bean has more. We're going to talk about that too. All right, let's go to the next one. Woof. This is a state project. Maybe you know it as Snoopy in a blender, but this is Monument with Standing Beast. When the state of Illinois announced their new Helmut Jahn designed building in 1980, they opened it in 1985. The artwork was chosen by a team including Helmut Jahn, the architect himself, and the Museum of Contemporary Art founder, Leonard Horowitz. They selected the sculpture. Horowitz's estate and the Graham Foundation were major funders. The work was donated to the state. I found that Illinois paid $30,000 for the unveiling, but I could not find a cost for the statue that the Horowitz family and other foundations paid. Murphy-Jahn associate Marty Belushi reflected on the design many years later, saying, I just remember, even having had exposure to art, thinking the public would struggle with it a bit. It was described by Dubuffet as a drawing that extends into space, made of 4 pieces. Each one is supposed to suggest a standing animal, a tree, a portal, and an architectural form. Very helpful. Viewers were invited to walk underneath it, and you could kind of look up and see a patch of sky, which was a little similar to the way that you would feel when you used to stand in the atrium of the Thompson Center, the building it's in front of. He, again, just created a maquette. His French fabrication shop cast the 10-ton work out of fiberglass, shipped to Chicago by boat, barely made it under the L tracks to its final destination. He died the next year at 83 years old. Dubuffet, that is. Now, this piece pisses me off a little. I like it, but my beef is this. In addition to the Dubuffet, the building was promised to be the most art-heavy building in the city, except for the Art Institute of Chicago. This was a plan championed by notable art lover, Governor James R. Thompson, who would later become the building's namesake. The interior was adorned with 19 works by Illinois artists, all purchased through the Art and Architecture program at a total cost of $367,000. So they paid 19 Illinois artists collectively a little bit more than they paid for Alexander Calder's sculpture, which just shows you what we think of our artists. Some of the Chicago images with work in the building include Ed Paschke, Roger Brown, Jim Nutt, Carl Worsam, Barbara Rossi, Gladys Nielsen, and Richard Hunt. Various sculptures, paintings, etc. They were largely publicly accessible until 2001 when they stopped letting people go up to the upper floors of the Thompson Center. Until 2015, the building also housed an art gallery featuring shows by Illinois artists and an artisan shop selling handmade goods by Illinois artists. It was unveiled in November of 1984. Again, I just want to point out, the whole building is a tribute to Illinois artists, and then we put an old fucking French guy's work in the plaza. This makes me so angry. Unveiled in November of 1984, the Chicago Tribune noted it stirred up as many reactions as there have been viewers: curiosity, bafflement, scorn, delight, skepticism, and downright fury. Those who viewed the unveiling described it as a waste of money, something my kids made in kindergarten, pretty stupid, schlock work, and the ugliest thing I've ever seen. A variety of Chicago Tribune journalists said the piece looks like something left out in the rain too long, resembles a gaggle of sad teeth who didn't brush themselves, all decayed at the edges and sort of lumpy. Described it as a cartoon environment plopped down in the middle of the real world, and my favorite insult: if this is a portrait, the government that sat for it is a big, confusing, and not very efficient. When it's funny, it's funny. Tourists weren't much kinder, said Ted Deerenfield of Phoenix. It's a good thing we don't have this in Arizona. Many locals worried about the longevity of the black and white statue. I think people are going to urinate on it, observed one. It's going to be all marked up, said a waitress nearby. Once the pigeons get a hold of it, I'm afraid it will be really a disaster, said another. This concern was actually anticipated. It was designed to be easy to clean and easy to paint. Dubuffet himself incorporated street language and graffiti and caricature into his works, and I kind of think he would have liked that people vandalized it, for what it's worth. Unfortunately, as we all probably know, the state of Illinois did the Thompson Center and its art dirty in the end. Again, they restricted access to the upper floors after 2001. The gallery and shop closed in 2015. The building was horribly expensive to operate because they cheaped out on the glass when they bought it or built it. By 2022, deferred maintenance costs amounted to over $325 million. And one guy walked through, Edmund McDevitt. He noted some of the artworks inside were dirty, missing parts, and in dire need of conservation. The building was sold in summer of 2022. The public plaza, no longer being public, needed to be rid of its artwork. So the monument with Standing Beast is currently in the process of conservation, and it's going to be moved to the Art Institute of Chicago. Reportedly, the state is looking into rehoming the other works by the 19 Illinois artists, our own artists, but there are no plans, and it seems like everyone has frickin' forgot about them. Honorable mentions? Oh, okay, all right, I'm actually on time now. Whew. All right, thank you. I practiced. Okay. Honorable mentions. Juan Moreau, I don't know. Moreau's Chicago, originally known as The Sun, the Moon, and One Star. Commissioned by the Brunswick Corporation, they later withdrew funding. Mayor Jane Byrne took this up as her project. She committed half of the $550,000 price tag. It was matched by a collection of individuals, institutions, etc. Moreau donated his design, but obviously they still had to build it. Vandalized in 1981 by an art student, hilariously. Notorious hater, journalist Bill Granger, felt tourists couldn't help but laugh about the lady with the fork coming out of her head. The Tribune's Roger Simon called it a toothy snow shovel stuck into an elongated football attached to blob-like arms resting on a gashed and pitted base. I mean, that one actually is fair. It never benefited from strong placement. If you've ever seen it, it's wedged between two buildings. You can barely see it. And in 2017, adding insult to injury, we built a loop-link bus station right in front of it. As the Tribune said in 2017, upon construction of the bus shelter, poor Miss Chicago stands as a vivid, visible reminder that public art, whoever owns it, is ever vulnerable and requires champions to protect it. Good example with the Thompson Center. Good example right next to it there, Chicago Rising from the Lake, 1954 by Ukrainian-American artist Milton Horn. This was a bronze relief put on the side of the city's first public parking garage. The garage was demolished in 1983 and the sculpture disappeared. The artist, Milton Horn, tracked it down in 1987 near the city's transportation department office, where it was found lying at the bottom of a tarp-covered swimming pool. Later moved to a metal scrapyard where it was rediscovered in 1994 with much press attention. It became a symbol of the city's failures to protect and keep track and maintain of all this public artwork they used taxpayer funding for. And sparked a movement in the 1990s to reform the Chicago Public Art Program. It was happy story and befitting the title, Chicago Rising from the Lake. It was reinstalled in 1998 at the Chicago Riverwalk at Columbus Drive Bridge, so you can go look at it today. We literally always do the images dirty. Raise your hand if you knew who the Chicago Imagists were before I started telling you about them. You guys are my favorite people. The rest of you need to spend some time on Google. Okay. Learn about your artists. Okay, so this is a mural called Plug Bug, painted by Chicago imagist Carl Worsom and local youth in 1991. So Block 37 is this brand new sculpture today, or sculpture. I would not call it that. Block 37 is a mall today, and there's this one tiny old building facing the plaza across the street, which is a ComEd substation. It was going to be too difficult to tear down, so it was the only thing that they left standing, and then they hired Carl Worsom to do this painting on the side of it. Described best by Lynn Becker. For a decade and a half, the plug bug has looked down at Block 37 and laughed. The creature that resembles the love child of a marriage between the Hindu god Vishnu and an L. Ron Hubbard alien. Where's the lie? Painted against a Pepto-Bismol background, has never been able to contain its amusement at the city's impotence to make Block 37 anything more than a square block dirt pile since it rushed to demolish every structure on the block. When they built Block 37, they entombed it. The mural is still there, but you can't see it. That's what we do to the images. Boo. Now, the modern era of public art in Chicago is much more whimsical, and this is kind of my own opinion here. I think this amount of public backlash about these truly inoffensive sculptures in these grand public plazas, I think the city got a little bit burnt, and a lot of the work that we would go on to make in more of the modern era was much more playful. I have a picture of 1999's Cows on Parade, very public-friendly project. Passerby would like touch and interact and sit on the cows. Tribune critic Alan Artner, not one of the haters, complimented the city's decision to please viewers who usually think contemporary art means an assault. This time, to the delight of the audience, comfort counted for more than challenge, and entertainment came before anything else. I think Millennium Park is a great example of this as well. Cloudgate, aka The Bean, by British artist Anish Kapoor. I mean, it's fun, it's interactive, it's instantly lovable. Cost a fortune, by the way, $38 million in today's money. And they were mad about the Calder. Come on, that thing cost $2 million. Kills me. Crown Fountain, designed by Spanish artist Jaime Plensa, though it does show pictures of everyday Chicagoans. It's functionally a splash pad for children in the summer. I mean, it's hard to hate it. It's fun. At nothing else, it's fun. Shit Fountain. Created by Polish artist Jerzy S. Kanar. He moved to Chicago in 1980. He is Polish. He enjoyed the Polish community here and decided to stay. He's actually hilariously internationally known for his religious works. He's also created... He's also created wood sculptures, which are at O'Hare, and the granite Black History Fountain at Renaissance Park. In 2005, fed up with locals who don't clean up after their dogs, Kanar built Shit Fountain, a waist-high column of concrete and sandstone upon which sits a coiled mound of bronze dog shit. He said, "This work is dedicated to all the dogs in the neighborhood." He is a dog lover. He actually owns pit bulls. He created the fountain to implore action from dog owners who let their animals shit in his flowers, and to be ironic and humorous, not, quote, to fight with somebody. This actually was beloved pretty quickly. We're quoting resident Jeanne Felknor, whose garden club has installed plants on more than 150 East Village parkways. "We're trying to make this neighborhood beautiful, and he puts up a shit fountain?" But I must say, after I saw it, I laughed all the way home. I mean, this sort of like playful, purposefully offensive, tongue-in-cheek work, I think would have made Paul Gabb have a heart attack. In summary, to quote Margaret Robinette from Outdoor Sculpture, the unavoidable truth is that not all outdoor sculpture is well received by its audience, the public. Sometimes animosity is exacerbated by misunderstanding to the point of stubborn rejection. And I'm on time. This part of my presentation is called "Those Damn Art Students." You have to read it like that. Okay, full disclosure. I am an art student. I graduated with my Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Art History, Theory, and Criticism from School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2015. Don't applaud, it was very expensive. I have the experience to say art students are natural provocateurs. It's also worth noting I represent SAIC on the road every fall, recruiting young art students all across the country. I am so familiar with what it means to be an art student. They are often social outsiders. They are always critical of cultural and societal norms, and they're often young. In many instances, their brains are still developing. They are learning empathy and wisdom, and they are at a school like School of the Art Institute of Chicago to learn the line between provocation for provocation's sake and true, challenging, thought-provoking art. Of course, art students are going to piss off old people. It's like they're literally trying to do that. Your freshman year at SAIC, if you talk to another graduate of SAIC, you all laugh about all of the like piss, shit, and menstrual blood you see freshman year because students are just trying to get a reaction out of people. And then over 4 years of study, sometimes longer, you learn that it's not just about getting a reaction, it's about the type of reaction you're trying to get. So cut them a little slack, all right? Now, I'm mostly going to focus on the 1980s, but I want to throw a quick example up. Art Institute students have been shocking people in this city since at least 1899. I love this. This is Nymph Fountain. Installed at night in 1899 on the lawn of the South Art Institute, it was a class project created by several of Laredo Taft's White Rabbits. That was a nickname for a group of female sculptors he mentored. Took credit for a lot of their work. Mostly a good thing, though. Not a lot of people were helping women sculptors get jobs and opportunities in 1899. History is complicated. No one is above reproach, and everybody deserves a little bit of empathy. Okay. It featured 8 nude female figures. It was only erected for 30 days, but Taft did consider making it permanent. As fountain historian Greg Borzo noted, it attracted crowds that required police to manage, with politicians, editorialists, and religious figures weighing in. The WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, obviously critiqued the subject matter, noting the nymph is not an intellectual goddess. Preachers thought nymphs should have been provided with raincoats. New York Times. Within a few weeks, nearly every figure in the fountain had been mutilated, and many nymphs had their hands and arms broken off. For what it's worth, the mayor, notoriously liberal vice district champion Carter Henry Harrison, felt it was, quote, not objectionable. So the mayor wasn't upset, just everybody else. You can kind of see on the slide, there's a crowd of people standing around this. Okay, but we're all right, we're going to talk about Harold Washington. This is a doozy of a story. All right, so we're going to talk about a painting called Mirth and Girth. But before I talk about that painting, it is important for me to start you with a little bit of background. And to do that, I'm going to start by dispelling a rumor. People spread rumors that Harold Washington was gay. I cannot say conclusively, but I feel pretty damn confident Harold Washington was not gay, and I'll tell you why. First of all, he had these political opponents, 29 aldermen, led by Fast Eddie, his nickname, Fast Eddie Verdoliak, and his buddy, Alderman Ed Burke, that one. They were prominent, vocal opponents of Washington. They blocked many of his measures. Verdoliak later became a Republican, for what it's worth. And Harold Washington's biographer, Gary Rivlin, noted, Washington's sexuality was a strange preoccupation for the 29, Verdoliak in particular. Adding fuel to his political opponents' fire, Washington supported the Anti-Discrimination Human Rights Ordinance passed in 1988, appointed the city's first LGBTQ liaison, and was the first mayor to speak at a gay pride rally. This did not sit well with all of his base, from Jesse Jackson's group all the way to Fast Eddie. There were a lot of people that didn't like this aspect of Harold Washington, and I can almost certainly say that's where those gay rumors are starting. So that was probably just gossip, but we do know Harold Washington liked the ladies. He was married once, divorced, casually dated this woman, Mary Ellis Smith, for 20 years, proposed to her in 1983 and stayed with her until his death. His friend, Bennett Johnson, was quoted in the book Fire on the Prairie as saying, "We drank scotch and chased women throughout the 1960s, spending a lot of time being boys." But this is my favorite one. Dolores Woods, longtime secretary who at one point lived in the same building as Washington during his, quote, wildest years, was quoted by her colleagues as saying, "If every woman Harold slept with stood at one end of City Hall, the building would sink 5 inches into LaSalle Street." I'm sex positive. Harold Washington, you go get it, buddy. I do think this is a hilarious quote, and I think about it a lot. I also am like, so did he like a lot of women or larger women? You could interpret it a few different ways. I'll leave you with this. In 1985, Harold Washington had adopted as his own a group of larger women, calling themselves the Refrigettes, in honor of the 1985 Bears rookie sensation William the Refrigerator Perry. This is Mayor Washington with the Refrigettes in 1985. They're amazing. They're cheerleaders, and he adopted them as his own. So anyway, he loved women. Good for him. All right. Now the death. Mayor Washington died suddenly in 1987, shortly after re-election, one day before Thanksgiving. His press secretary had been talking to the mayor when he slumped over his desk suddenly, unconscious. He actually initially mistook Harold Washington as reaching for something, perhaps a pencil. Log that up here. That pencil's going to come back. Paramedics failed to revive him in the office. They rushed him to Northwestern Hospital. They did all these crazy, really desperate, technologically advanced methods to try to revive him, but he was pronounced dead. Rumors and conspiracies about his death began swirling immediately. Thanks, undoubtedly, Fast Eddie, for delaying. By January 7th, the rumors had gotten so bad that his family was publicly calling for an end to unfounded speculations and insinuations about the cause of his death. People were like, he was doing drugs. His physician conclusively revealed he had died from a heart attack caused by significant arterial blockage. It was noted he was 100 pounds overweight, suffering from hypertension, high cholesterol, and an enlarged heart. He had smoked 2 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day for years and was well remembered by everyone for his unhealthy eating habits. I mean, it was the most clear-cut dude died of a heart attack situation you could possibly think of. Thousands of shocked and saddened Chicagoans attended his wake. The Chicago Tribune depicted a city convulsed in grief. Women sank, sobbing onto plaza benches. A man sat and buried his head in his hands. He had been the city's first black mayor, a successful political reformer, a progressive, and a dedicated public servant throughout his whole career. It's actually why he often said that he wasn't really interested in having a relationship with a woman, because he was so committed to his job. Harold Washington, many consider him the best mayor Chicago ever had, certainly one of the least corrupt. I don't know that much about corruption, so I can't definitively say he was. But, he was this beloved public figure. But here's the painting. We're going to talk about it, don't worry. By April, SAIC student and noted shit stirrer David K. Nelson Jr. began to find the ceaseless commemoration tiring. Harold Washington is like an icon, he told the Sun-Times. He's like a deity. Last week, I saw a poster they're selling. It shows the skyline of Chicago with the clouds swirling above. And on one side, there's Jesus looking down on Chicago. And on the other side, Harold Washington is looking down on Chicago. And I said, oh, come on, this is ridiculous. This is the poster. It's called Worry Ye Not. Nelson had already gained a reputation at SAIC for making work that was obnoxious, irreverent, and satiric. He'd previously created caricatures of his parents, professors, and even SAIC president Tony Jones, who you're going to hear a lot about Tony Jones. He also came hot on the heels of the Chicago Imagists, who made this grotesque, irreverent, challenge the establishment type of work. He was a 22-year-old shit stirrer. Name a single boy the age of 22 who's not a little bit of a shit stirrer. He was an edgelord before they had a term for it. With the school's annual fellowship competition approaching, showcasing soon-to-be graduates, Nelson decided to create a humanized painting of Mayor Washington, referencing an unsubstantiated rumor that doctors had removed the mayor's suit in the hospital and discovered female underwear underneath. He even painted a little pencil into Harold Washington's hand. Yikes, a little tasteless for sure. He actually entered several pieces into the exhibition. It was displayed privately in the school's interior hallways. You know, graduating student shows, I'm not sure the public should go to them. Like, again, there's like piss and blood and controversy. Yeah, art students, man, they're okay. Anyway, it wasn't open to the public, and that's pretty important. It was just open to the school community. But I want to talk a little bit about this title, Mirth and Girth. There's two different things this could refer to. The first, it could refer to the Chicago Girth and Mirth Club. Girth and Mirth clubs were sex-positive social support groups for predominantly heavy-set gay men. First one started in San Francisco in 1976. Chicago's chapter was organized in 1981 by Ira Jones. You can actually see this incredible picture of the Chicago Girth and Mirth Club in the 1990s and their May 1988 Girth-shaking newsletter. I tracked these down from this amazing librarian named Tim at the San Francisco Public Library. Thank you, Tim. I hope he watches this. So it's very possible with all these gay rumors with the lingerie that he was referencing Girth and Mirth clubs. Oh, spoiler alert. It's also possible that he was referring to the refrigerettes. So a Sun-Times reporter actually wrote, when describing Mayor Washington's relationship with the refrigerettes in 1985, that all of their cheers celebrate food and girth with mirth. Nelson read a lot of news. It's very possible this stuck with him. It's also very possible he was referring to the, gay clubs. It could be interpreted either way, but I think it's a very bold title choice either way. Nelson thought that painting might stir some interest, but underestimated how much. As soon as the exhibition opened and visitors saw Nelson's painting, it became the focus of outraged attention. A security guard was posted in front of it. They began getting phone calls and bomb threats. The media arrived looking for Nelson. He was standing in the corner of the room wearing sunglasses going, "Oh, fuck." Paraphrasing. School administrators began looking for him. They eventually got word to him that they wanted him to remove the piece from the exhibition. He refused. How exactly City Council found out about a private student exhibition is unknown. But it fanned tensions. City Council was a tense place at this time. The interim mayor had just fired a black mayoral aide for making anti-Semitic statements the week before. Things were very tense. Alderman Bobby Rush soon passed a resolution threatening to cut off the city's support of the Art Institute unless they immediately removed the painting and apologized. This was passed. Aldermans Bill Henry and Ernest Jones head to the school. According to one source, Henry brandished a gun. Jones removed the painting and placed it on the floor facing the wall. They left. A student rehung the painting. They're edgelords. I have a lot of respect for them, but they're edgelords. Alder people Alan Streeter, Bobby Rush, and Dorothy Tillman arrived next, alongside officers from the Chicago Police Department. They took the painting down, wrapped it in brown paper to keep people from seeing it, and tried to remove it from the school. They were diverted to the office of SAIC President Tony Jones. By the time the painting arrived in Tony Jones's office, it had a 1-foot gash. Oh, no, nobody knows how it got there. Seriously, nobody knows how it got there. The alderman told Jones they were there to enforce the city council's resolution. Alderman Tillman was heated. She was threatening to burn the painting in Jones's office. The police were like, no, don't do that. Jones was made to sign a statement promising it would not be shown again without city approval. The police superintendent called. He ordered that the painting be taken into police custody. Accompanied by the alderman, it was taken outside to a waiting police car. There's a little snapshot here. As you can imagine, this was televised. This was broadcast widely. Aldermen and the students engaged in a volatile shouting match. The aldermen were like, "This is an insult. This is racist." The students were like, "Where are the artist's constitutional rights to free expression?" The next few days were very busy. Mirth and Girth was picked up by representatives of the ACLU from the police department and released back to its artist, David Nelson. The president of the Art Institute's board issued a public apology and agreed to the alderman's demands, saying that SAIC would make an attempt to hire more black teachers, administrators, and recruit more black students. Only 6% of the Art Institute's 1,400 students at the time were black. This continues to be a problem that SAIC struggles with. Students protested outside the school, waving placards that said "Honk for free speech" and "Harold stood for freedom." And that is very interesting because Harold Washington was a huge champion of civil rights and civil liberties. So I didn't know the guy, but I think Harold Washington would have kind of found this funny. Venus Blue, a black student at the school, publicly worried that her own display, which featured pictures of Trinidadian women in suggestive poses, might also be removed. Tony Jones met with the students, assured them that the Art Institute stood behind their First Amendment rights, but said Nelson's painting was in poor taste. I mean, it was. Some professors, defended the artist's motivations. Others were like, I don't really think he understood what he was up to. Most acknowledged it as offensive, but faculty were basically like, Nelson gave a few interviews, but refused to apologize. Asked about Harold Washington, he said, I actually respected the man, but that doesn't mean he is a deity, that he can only be dealt with in a certain way. I think that Harold Washington and his memory and what he's done for the city are so great that one little painting shouldn't tarnish his image. And I mean, political figures do open themselves up to critiques and paintings of them in their underwear, unfortunately. It is part of being a public figure, and art students being edgelords are gonna try to come after you, especially if they, I don't know, find it funny or think it would be an interesting painting. Nelson, for the record, was mostly perturbed by people saying he sucked at painting. Now, the ACLU quickly announced it would sue the police department on behalf of the artist. After working its way through the courts, the case was decided 6 years later in early 1994. The U.S. Court of Appeals 7th Circuit sided with artist David Nelson, ruling that his civil rights of free speech under the First Amendment and his rights against search and seizure, the Fourth Amendment, had both been violated. Quoting the decision, Richard Allen Posner, Chief Judge, remarked, "We must ask whether the law was clear that local government officials may not go onto private property without invitation, seize a painting they do not like because it vilifies a public official with whom they had been associated, wrap it in brown paper, and remove it so that no one can see it. To ask the question is pretty much to answer it." The decision also addressed insinuations that the painting was racist, noting that implying someone may be a sexual deviant is not a racial slur. It also took issue with the claim that the painting was made with the intent to incite a riot or that it was causing an angry mob. Judge Posner pointed out that the angriest people on site were the aldermen, who should have been setting an example of cool self-restraint. And he was like, the policemen, the handful of guys that were there, clearly had it under control. In the aftermath, the city of Chicago eventually settled, agreeing to pay $95,000 to end the litigation. All of that went to ACLU attorney fees. The city issued a detailed set of procedures to Chicago police defining the limited circumstances in which materials protected by the First Amendment may be seized. Said Nelson, "I've had my 15 minutes of fame. I hope this doesn't affect my career too much." When asked whether he changed his painting style, he said, "No, I don't want to make art that everybody loves." The painting was never repaired, displayed, sold, or shown ever again. It was later reported that David went on to work in advertising. I do think it affected his career. I could not track him down. David, call me. Look at these adorable men. I love it. Okay. Just 1 year later, just 1 year after the Mirth and Girth incident in spring of 1989, Dred Scott Tyler, a graduating senior, entered a controversial piece into a juried SAIC student exhibition, specifically showcasing the work of 66 minority students. Dred Scott was 24, black, and a Chicagoan, born to a middle-class South Side family. The school administration attempted to have him withdraw the piece. He refused, and it was reluctantly included. Titled, "What is the Proper Way to Display an American Flag?" The interdisciplinary work consisted of an American flag laid flat on the floor. Viewers could choose to walk across the flag to access a wall-mounted shelf. On the wall, photos depicting flag burnings and flags draped over coffins. On the shelf, directly above the flag, a comment book where viewers could write their feelings and answer the question posed by the artwork's title. Asked about it decades later, Scott said, "I wanted to make work that implicated the viewer in these questions one way or another." People expressed a range of social and political perspectives. Interestingly enough, this was not the first time the piece had been displayed. It actually had been displayed at an alternative art space in Chicago just a few months prior, and no one said anything. The exhibition opened on February 17th, 1989. This time it was open to the public. It was a public exhibit, unlike David K. Nelson's scenario. Within a week of opening, protests, death threats, bomb threats, people threatened to punch Tyler in the nose and deport him to the Soviet Union. The press soon followed with cameras. You can see this great photo here. Thousands of people stood in line to see it. Best attended SCIC student show of all time. Go check out what they're doing down there. You'll see some fun stuff. And maybe you'll get angry, and they'll love that. Some picked up the flag, folded it, and placed it on the shelf. Senator Walter Dodich even showed up with a bucket of sand and a pole and hung it up. Visitors' comments filled 400 pages. "Shame," wrote one. "I protested the war in the late 60s, said another. "I never thought I'd side with the veterans." Yeesh. 10 days later, on February 27th, a group of 60 military veterans and their supporters marched outside the school. A larger group of students met them there with signs reading, "Anti-patriotism is not a crime." Though not all of the students approved of the work, they all thought he had the right to display it. Chicago police had learned their lesson. Chicago police were like, "You are not criminally liable for the piece, but technically any viewer who walks on the flag can be charged with a felony." 4 students were eventually arrested for flag desecration as part of the protests. The same day, the student newspaper, shout out F News Magazine, published a letter from Scott. He stood by his work. I love this quote. "It is absolutely necessary to offend the sentiments of this vicious patriotism. Frankly, if black people had not been willing to offend and anger people, we would still be chattel slaves." Fuck. Hell yeah, brother, dude. Hell yeah. Meanwhile, the senator and representatives from veterans organizations filed a suit in Cook County Circuit Court to close down the show. The school did close the exhibition on the day of the protests. This was a very unpopular decision from students and faculty alike. 3 days later, on March 2nd, poor SEIC president Tony Jones is dragged back into courts over some controversial work his students are making. Just put yourself in Tony Jones's shoes here for a minute. Like, this guy went through this whole debacle 1 year ago. He's like, "All right, we're going to get more black students. We're going to get more black faculty. We're going to do all this stuff." 1 year later, a black student puts on something. It's a whole nother rigmarole. And the guy's got to be going, "God damn it, man. I can't win." That's my personal perspective. I haven't asked Tony Jones, but surely he must have been getting out of his car, walking into that courthouse going, okay. So this court case was dismissed immediately. It was ruled that no laws had been violated. The judge even said this exhibit is as much an invitation to think about the flag as it is an invitation to step on it. He reminded the court of First Amendment protections. And he took a firmer defensive stance for his students. He said, "The responsibility of institutions like ours is to protect art, no matter how controversial, charming, or soporific." He even proposed that day an international symposium to address art that angers. Referring to the Mirth and Girth debacle, he said, "What better place than Chicago?" Following the court appearance, the security was beefed up. The gallery was reopened to the SAIC community, but not the public, though students and faculty wanted them to. The school stood by the artwork and let it remain up through the scheduled closure of the show on March 18th, even though while it was still on display, state legislators passed resolutions on March 14th calling for its removal. City Council passed an ordinance on March 16th prohibiting mutilation and defacing the American flag. The only thing SAC said was like, "Hey man, you can't put this in the graduation show." Unfortunately, consequences were still to come. Word spread to Washington. George H.W. Bush himself described the work as disgraceful. 1 day before the exhibition's closure, the United States Senate voted unanimously. The United States Senate doesn't vote unanimously on anything. To make it illegal to deliberately display the flag on the ground because of an art student in Chicago. Governor Jim Thompson, to his credit, while expressing his disagreement, signed a bill in July that eliminated state grants to the school, slashing funding from $130,000 to just $1. Many private benefactors pulled donations, and as you can imagine, lots of locals had thoughts as well. Tribune columnist Clarence Page remarked that it shouldn't take a college degree to figure out that anyone who lays an American flag on the floor and invites comments on it should expect to receive something other than love notes. Another Chicago artist reportedly responded to Scott's work by putting a large picture of him on the floor and calling it, "What is the proper way to display Scott Tyler?" Another Tribune reporter, Anthony D'Amato, was much kinder. He referenced a 1974 Supreme Court decision in the midst of the Vietnam War, affirming the right of a student to modify the flag and display it as a political opinion. D'Amato went on to say, most people would agree that a good work of art attacks us emotionally. All art is, in a sense, political. And indeed, the pendulum began to swing back the other way. In September of 1989, the ACLU, again, sued the city over their flag desecration ordinance, working on behalf of 10 artists, including Scott. Before the end of the year, the ordinance was a judge decided the ordinance could not be used to prosecute artists. 3 cases had already been making their way through the court system at this time, protecting flag burning as free speech. 2 of those court cases made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Scott joined activists on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington in 1990, burning flags as this decision was being made. Eventually, it resulted in official U.S. Supreme Court decision that laws against vandalizing the flag were unconstitutional. Hell yeah. You go burn that flag, you guys, if you want. Or make it into art. Scott wasn't deterred, and he did not disappear like David K. Nelson. In December of 1989, he again put the piece in a flag-centric exhibition at Chicago's Lannan Gallery. The police department, regarding the show in December, said there will be no arrests and indicated the police won't be taking any actions. In 1996, the work was again displayed in Arizona at a show exploring the use and abuse of the flag by artists. Other works in the same show included a flag and a toilet bowl and a flag of human skin. His art did fail to become commercially successful. Throughout the 1990s, he worked as a graphic designer and a computer programmer. But in the 2010s, Dred Scott Tyler has come back in a big way. People are looking back on this work much more affectionately, with much more nuance, with much less heated opinions about flag burning. I think a lot of Americans feel a certain way about the flag right now. In more recent history, he's participated in shows at prestigious museums like the Whitney, given TED Talks, won competitive fellowships as recently as last year, and returned to lecture at SAIC in 2018. Controversy still finds him. He says that he continues to make high-profile work that is often polarizing and blunt and remains no stranger to death threats. His exhibits continue to be shut down from time to time. Whew. Believe it or not, I'm on time. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to take a... Sorry, guys. How was I going to cut any of this out? This brings us to our final portion of this talk. Part 4. Where are we now? Chicago is in the midst of a process we started about 5 years ago of re-examining all of our existing monuments in public art, at least those that are not currently sitting in a Department of Transportation swimming pool somewhere on the south side. It's okay, we got that one. In February of 2020, the Chicago Board of Education adopted a new policy for acquiring, maintaining, and potentially removing art. They created a steering committee to kind of evaluate concerns raised by controversial artworks in Chicago public schools. Complicating matters, though, the federal government actually owns all WPA murals and artworks, so CPS cannot legally move or remove these pieces without a little bit of federal input, which does make it complicated. Quite a few offensive works abound in the Chicago School District. There's a CPS office building in Garfield Park featuring a particularly well-hated depiction of indigenous people in service of white men. Adding insult to injury, this is the same building housing the system's American Indian Education Program. They're working on it. Some have been removed. They were making moves to remove this 1913 painting of Christopher Columbus in Trumbull Elementary, although the school itself was closed. It went into storage. as far as I can tell. Of course, you guys maybe remember this. In July of 2020, protests erupted over a 1933 Christopher Columbus statue in Grant Park. Demonstrators attempted to pull down the statue. Police showed up, pepper sprayed people, physical altercations resulted, dozens of people were injured. And then Mayor Lori Lightfoot did something I call pulling a Meg's Field. In the middle of the night, she removed 3 statues of Columbus and put them into storage. I love when a mayor pulls a Meg's Field. In response, in 2020, the Mayor Lightfoot formed a committee to study the city's 500 public monuments and memorials to identify problematic artworks and recommend new ones. The Chicago Monuments Project was born. Their goals include cataloging public art on city property. We cannot even give you a precise number of how many public arts there are, just more than 500. Their other goal is to appoint an advisory committee to determine which pieces warrant attention or action. They are going to be making recommendations for new works that could be commissioned and creating a platform for the public to engage in comment. So if there's art in your community that you hate, check out the Chicago Monuments Project. They would like to know. In January of 2021, the Chicago Monuments Project leaders flagged 41 pieces of public art for further review. Selected works were identified because of the following issues, and I'm going to paraphrase here. Because they promoted white supremacy, presented gross depictions of indigenous people, memorialized bad racist people, or presented narrow, one-sided views of history, or just otherwise create tension in the Chicago community. In August of 2022, they issue recommendations for those pieces. 13 monuments were recommended to be either removed or kept in storage, including all 3 Columbus statues, including George Pullman's tasteless Fort Dearborn Massacre monument, which is also already in storage, 4 inaccurate plaques, 2 Marquette Joliet monuments, 2 monuments to racist assholes, General Sheridan and Melville Fuller, and the Italo Balbo monument. Sorry, my Italian is a little rusty. They identified 6 works for interventions. Now, when they say interventions, they're like talking about hiring artists to create work that kind of acts in conversation or covers some of the original piece to kind of change its meaning. George Washington was recommended, the Congress Plaza, Bowman and Spearman statues, 3 DuSable bridge reliefs. The DuSable bridge reliefs, they are terrible. They are really bad depictions of the Fort Dearborn affair and indigenous people, but they are part of the physical structure of the bridge. So interventions for those. And my personal favorite, President William McKinley's statue in McKinley Park. Why I love that this is on the shit list, is because the William McKinley statue was fabricated from a universally disliked bronze statue of Christopher Columbus, which was melted down and reused to reduce the statue's cost. This bronze material in this sculpture cannot catch a break. They don't plan to tear down McKinley, they just want to intervention it. And then 18 more works were chosen to receive new narratives, new descriptions, better contextualization of the work, and the history surrounding the figures that it commemorates, including Statue of the Republic, the 1906 version, and that damn Haymarket riot monument. That one's just getting new narratives. Unfortunately, Mayor Lightfoot left office without taking the recommended actions. The Joint Civic Committee of Italian Americans is currently engaged in a lawsuit with the city over the removal of the Columbus monuments, as well as the Italo Balbo monument. Basically, it was a gift from Mussolini, a fascist. But the Italians paid for it. Remember how I said immigrant groups would pay for all these different things? They paid for several of the Columbus statues, and they have been caretakers of the Italo Balbo monument. So they're very heated about the idea of these being removed. The Johnson administration received a $6.8 million grant from the Mellon Foundation, which they are putting towards the creation of 8 new monuments and interventions, including the Chicago Torture Memorial, this really cool piece by Amanda Williams. But he has not made much progress towards the other recommendations from the committee, has not removed any statues as far as I'm aware of. In highlighting how challenging the project proves to be, Adam Green mused in the Chicago Monuments Project report, "What values of ours are likely to be judged as narrow, naive, or brutally misguided, and which ones might actually prove serviceable to the future?" Now, the last thing I want to mention, I threw in at the last fucking minute because I got a text on my way here from my friend being like, "You're talking about offensive public art." There is a puppet up at the Chicago Cultural Center right now that depicts, I'm going to leave it general here, some political opinions about the Israel-Palestine debacle. And it has angered a coalition of 27 aldermen who are criticizing it, asking for it to be removed, and demanding to understand the selection process for artwork that goes into the Cultural Center. And this is so timely because clearly aldermen have not learned. And it's very important that I stand here today, or sit here today, to remind those aldermen that back in 1988, we very conclusively decided that aldermen are not allowed to raise a stink about art. So we'll see how that unfolds. Okay, so chicagomonuments.org, check it out. I found this in the span of my research, and I had to put it as my last slide. This is a news article called "A Day of Art in Chicago" by Chicago Tribune journalist Phyllis Magdia from 1988. I almost lost my shit because this, this news article suggests this like day of public touring, public monuments in Chicago, and suggests finishing off our day at John Barleycorn Memorial Pub. We are in what used to be John Barleycorn's. 658 West Belden, where while you eat, you can watch any of the 3 4x4-foot screens which show changing art slides using 50 carousels, each holding 80 slides, representing every kind of art from welded steel pieces to icons to fine paintings. Y'all should bring it back. Although I guess this counts, right? Like, I think I had 50 slides, so. Anyway, party like it's 1988, am I right? Okay, so in conclusion, the last thing that I want to say, and I am not that bad on overtime, sorry for holding you hostage here for so long. In all of the artwork I've shown tonight, I have strived to include as many Chicago and Illinois-based artists as possible. I included 15 Chicago artists. Creators of our highly visible public art have overwhelmingly been French, British, European, Spanish, or Americans from New York City. As we look back at our history, at our people criticizing our public art en masse for being weird or ugly or expensive, as we struggle with the type of representation our public art provides, as we grow frustrated with its insufficiencies and lack of nuance, I can't resist pointing at the source, at the civic leaders who sought to purchase culture from the most famous instead of the best suited to the job, at the artists who came from far away, visited our city briefly, if ever at all, and decided themselves fit to design symbols of our city. And when our own artists, people from our own city, were given a rare opportunity to create public art, we derided them too, we protested their work, we destroyed it, and we entombed it. Why do we repeatedly fail to support our own? At the end of the day, Chicagoans are diverse people. As the saying goes, opinions are like assholes, everybody has one. But I can't help but think, and put this in your mind, that if we hire our own artists to create our public art, at least the asshole with an opinion is your neighbor, and he can tell you what he thinks of your art by simply buying you a shot of Malort. Thank you.